Thank you for inviting me to talk today about essentially taking optical pulse SETI and extending it down into near-infrared and potentially maybe into the infrared regime. And I find it quite remarkable that it's been 55 years essentially since the Schwartz and Towns paper that suggested that lasers would be a prime use for interstellar communication. And it's been 33 years since the Towns paper that suggested really the regime that we want to look at with laser communication is in the infrared. And the reason why that it's taken this long is because we had to wait for the technology in our detectors to catch up. We needed to wait for high sensitivity infrared detectors, and in this case with high bandwidth, to do pulsed SETI. So I'm going to tell a little bit of that story here today. First, I want to go and think about the pillars of why the infrared is a good regime for laser communication. So if you just look at the Milky Way, its spectral energy distribution, at the ultraviolet, the optical, and the infrared out to 10 microns, and you look where the peak brightness is, it's in the optical, okay, as we might expect, since we're dominated by stars. And it precipitously drops off as you go into the mid-infrared regime. So this is where we are in the near-infrared as we're going across that drop. Okay, so this is just looking at our Milky Way and thinking about how we do not want to be swamped by our galactic background. Similarly, if we presume that they're communicating next to their host star, we have to look at the effective temperature of those stars and think about their effective black bodies of this. So stars, faint stars, right? Low mass, 300 Kelvin here, ranging up to 10 million Kelvin in their photospheres, peak out into the optical and ultraviolet. That makes sense based on what I just showed you with our galaxy. And if you look at the near-infrared and even pushing down into the Rayleigh Jeans section of the black body, this is where you would want to be. You don't want to be dominated by the photons of your star. Now, probably most importantly, depending on the distance that they are communicating, the thing that matters here is interstellar extinction. Okay, so if we just communicate over 1,000 light years, or 0.3 kiloparsecs, which is this curve right here, okay, so 100% transmission through the interstellar medium versus wavelengths to 10 microns, here's our curve. And if you're at the optical regime, you only get 70% of those original photons. If you go out to 1 kiloparsecs, okay, 3,200 light years, you get 30% of it. So it just doesn't make sense. You want your big bang for the buck. So depending on the distance, it makes a difference. And so this is a prime reason why we would like to move into the infrared. Before I tell the story of how we got into the near-infrared realm here in the last 3 years, I need to go back and think about how we've been doing this in the last 15 years. So with Wertheimer and Horowitz's work, we've done targeted and all-sky searches, and the detector technology with that is with photomultiplier tubes, which essentially works out to about 900 nanometers. Okay? So they have high quantum efficiency. You can get your fast bandwidth. You get your fast nanosecond regime within it. And what they learned quickly is that if you just use one photomultiplier tube, you get swamped with false positive signals. This led our group to begin putting multiple detectors in coincidences to see if it would be very statistically improbable if the photons arrived at multiple detectors at once. So here's our LIC Observatory optical SETI experiment. It ran for a number of years. We used three photomultiplier tubes to reduce that false alarm rate. Okay? And this is how we did our analysis. We are beam counters. This is it. This is the simplicity of it. We counted the counts in the photons, and our wow signal here is all of these ones, okay? Because we would get an improbable coincidence between all three of those photomultiplier tubes. So I want to keep this in mind when I push this forward now into our new experiment. And really the limitations were that we didn't have PMTs that had high enough quantum efficiency to probe down into the infrared regime. So about 3 years ago, our group, which has stuck together for the last 15 years, we're interested in exploring new high bandwidth near-infrared avalanche photodiodes. And so a group of students and myself, we went and visited the current companies on this, and we discovered that there were about 2 companies that were doing a very interesting readout process with APD detectors. We purchased these, we brought them to the lab, we characterized them, and found out, yes, indeed, these would be good for a pulsed near-infrared SETI search. So this is just showing that they have fast rise times. This is about half a nanosecond here, and we've published a paper in SPIE a couple of years characterizing these detectors. So the process for this is called internal discrete amplification APDs. Paul alluded to this with his photomultiplier tubes. And it's important to think about this. We're using single photometers, and we want high gain. Okay, so we want, for every photon, we want a lot of photoelectrons to come out of this. So we have a high gain with the system, and this is achieved because it actually essentially has micro-scale photodetectors and one single photometer. That means that as one pixel is getting hit by your photons, it quenches, but the neighboring pixel is right there, ready to quench again. So this gave us low quench times within these systems, low noise, and large dynamic range. And that's what we needed for a pulse SETI. And so we took these detectors, we did our optical design, and one of the challenges for this is that they only have about 200 micron active areas. Okay, so they're teeny. Okay, so they're teeny compared to our PMTs. So here's our cartoon layout of the system that we designed. At top is our telescope. We actually put a dichroic here to send the optical light into a guide camera. This is because we have a very small active area that we need to keep the sources on. We then put in a calibration source, so we put in a near-infrared pulse laser that pulses at different frequencies, but as well as at a nanosecond pulse. We actually put in a filter wheel. We were interested in this because we wanted to do some astrophysics with this detector as well. And then getting to this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but we spent a lot of thought on this, which was the number of detectors. Because if you just increase the number of detectors, and this came up in our discussions earlier, increase the number of telescopes, you decrease your sensitivity. Okay, so what you'd really want is that you understand one detector, you could characterize it against your false positives with a true signal. And in this case, we think we do. We think we're really starting to understand these detectors. So we put a translation stage that can move in and out, and we can run the system at high sensitivity with one detector, or we can put in that translation stage, split the light into 2 detectors, and do our typical coincidence type of detections. All of this was designed to be economical. Besides the detectors, everything's off the shelf, and to be reproducible so we can put multiple systems on multiple telescopes. So here is the near-infrared SETI program. We call it NIROSETI, near-infrared optical SETI. It's very compact. It's mounted at the 1-meter telescope at Lick Observatory, which we all can see from where we're here in the Silicon Valley. Here's the light coming down from the telescope. In this case, the telescope light's not coming down through our detectors. We've moved our translation stage where we have our pulse laser system here to calibrate it. The dichroic sits here, an optical guide camera with this funny porcupine thing to cool it, filter wheels, and then here's our 2 detectors on either one of these ends. We had first light last year, okay, so in March 14th in 2015. This is just the classic, we have first light. The challenge again was alignment. We have these 200 micron area detectors, so we had to move around that star until it actually fell, and we found optical alignment. So here's our count rate and noise, and that's us getting a star with intermittent clouds coming through that night. I want to spend a little bit time talking about post-processing and signal detection, and go back to where we were started with Pulsed-optical SETI. So for our processing, we're using a 2.5 gigahertz oscilloscope, and our standard operation is similar to that Pulsed-optical SETI, was triggering with a threshold with 1 or 2 detectors. But for each source that we target, we save a portion of the waveform to do more advanced algorithms. Okay, so we do coincidence, yes, between two detectors. We can do analysis with this full waveform at varying time resolutions, okay, down to 1 nanosecond to out to a microsecond. Okay, this again is interesting for astrophysical sources, but allows us to have a larger dynamic range in time. We also then can do comparisons of our full pulse height distributions. This gets into this idea of just using a single detector and lowering your sensitivity on that. And we can do Fourier transforms and look for periodicities within the signals. So to show this in some of our pictures here, here's our waveform of detector 1 in blue, detector 2 in, I guess, brown here. Here's our spurious dark pulses, right, that would mimic a single photon response. And here's our pulse signal here that we get between this, and we say, yes, we have a coincidence. When we turn on our calibration, here's our near-infrared pulse laser. This is just our triggering time and the frequency for this within this time in nanoseconds. This is just an offset between detector 1 and detector 2, showing what we would get if you had a seriously booming signal in your instrument. Okay, but the point from this is if you look at this versus time, this is real data, you have the coincidence in magenta here shows your coincidence in dark model, right? You have two detectors, you have Poisson noise, what's the statistical probability of those dark pulses aligning? And then you have the pulse height distribution of your light here, so in red is detector 2 and detector 1 in blue, and then you have your coincidence model measured in turquoise, okay? So you can use your pulse height distribution understanding your dark, right? Understanding the Poisson statistics of these detectors, and then simply just looking at the differential between those pulse height distributions. So this is a very powerful way to do your detections, and again, probe down in sensitivity. Similarly, for every source, using this waveform, we can then just look at a periodogram. We take the fast Fourier transform to that waveform, and we can put thresholds to that to notify us if there's any, well, this is our pulse laser system, but if there's anything that sits above that threshold. Okay, so that's what we're doing. What are we looking at? So we've been working on target list, and we're trying to look at essentially panchromatic SETI. So we're looking at a similar list that Breakthrough Listen is using with the Green Bank telescope and Parkes and the automatic planet finder. So we're looking at nearby main sequence stars and giants that are within 50 parsecs. Okay? So this is our every night list. In fact, we just observed this last 4 nights up at Lick. Our additional targets are known systems that have Earth-like translits all within a kiloparsec, because they would be interestingly in the line of sight. So maybe they're more likely to see us because they've seen us transit. We're also looking at a range of galaxies and globular clusters. And then again, we're looking at a bunch of pulsars, okay, with this varying time resolutions. Currently, if you take what we're observing, we observe about 12 nights. We have 12 nights on the telescope per month. And if you take that efficiency, it'd be about 50%. We get about 1,400 targets per year. Okay. Now, where are we going with this? Okay, this was just the first near-infrared SETI experiment. We learned a ton about our instrumentations and our detectors. But as you may know, the telecom industry and the defense are pushing a lot on advancing this regime. So we're working with these companies to then take this technology of discrete amplification and moving them into array sizes. So if you have, this is an example that we just procured. It's a 5x5 array. Now, if you think of, if this is where each one of these is a 200 micron array, and these are trying to get larger and larger. But this is super powerful, because throw away now that this n number of detector business, right? Running beam splitters, you don't need it. If you have readouts on every single one of these arrays here, you can simply put these in coincidences. So you can put 25 in coincidences, 5 in coincidences. You can bin however you want. It's actually very powerful how you can do your readout here. This would improve your field of view. It improves your sensitivity, and essentially can move us into what we want to push through, which is a drift scan mode, where we get larger patches of the sky. And maybe more mundane, we're trying to work to automate the telescope and automate our observing process so we increase our efficiency per source. Okay, so to summarize, this is the first near-infrared SETI experiment. It took us essentially like 55 years to get here, but I think we're here. And there's many advantages, I hope, that I've showed that communicating with infrared lasers across interstellar distances is very, very advantageous. We're using a process of discrete in-gas APDs. They have other astrophysical and other applications within STEM that are quite interesting. So I recommend following these detectors. The survey is underway, and we're doing real-time data analysis. We're trying to really push on our post-processing techniques and how we actually do our detections. And we're working with new detectors and vendors to try to make this a larger field effort. Okay, thank you.
Questions? Okay, well, I have one. So as you begin to work with these arrays, you were still in the targeting mode. So do you defocus so that the starlight goes over more of the array space?
If you get to an array size large enough, I implied it in the slide, which is that you could just do drift scan mode. So you don't even need to do targeted search anymore. And if you take Phil's calculations, we should just be looking at any random patch of the sky. So you can do that, and we do it because you want to spread it across it. Our detectors, just to maybe explain where your question's coming from, our detector is operating in the pupil plane. Okay, so we're just looking across that.